Whenever I hear this parable, I am reminded of Lisa's and my first home that we bought, our first yard, and our first garden. It was so great to move out of an apartment with little pots of flowers to have a 6-foot garden. And I planted snapdragons and marigolds and zinnias, the flowers from my childhood, and it was beautiful. Now, we also had, this garden was right under the front window, and there was a walkway that led from the front door to the driveway. So every time you left the house, you saw the pretty little garden. On the other side of that path was the lawn. I'm doing air quotes because it was very straggly. It was not sod or anything. But as I was walking out that front gate, I saw something growing next to the gate. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's not my garden. It's supposed to be grass, and that doesn't look like grass. So it must be a weed. It's not supposed to be there. So I chopped it down, and it grew back. So I chopped it down, and it grew back. And I chopped it down again and again and again and again, and it kept growing back. Eventually, I got lazy. I stopped chopping, pulling, and cutting, and this clump of weed grew. And every time I passed it, I thought, oh my gosh, I gotta chop that weed down again. But I didn't. It was too hot, and I was too busy, and so it grew. And it wasn't a weed at all. It was a beautiful hibiscus plant. Now, I know it sounds crazy that I didn't recognize that, I didn't know the difference between a hibiscus plant and a weed, but we were new to Florida, and we didn't have hibiscus in Ohio. But the best part is, all that chopping I did was excellent pruning. So there were millions of hibiscus flowers. All right, so last week, our parable focused on seeds and soil. And this week, it's the weeds. Now, dandelions are the weeds from my childhood, and I loved them. I thought dandelions were magical. I mean, first they were yellow, and then they did that puffy thing, make a wish. And who doesn't love a dandelion bouquet, lovingly picked and delivered through tiny little hands? One might argue that it's more precious than long-stemmed roses delivered by the florist. But I remember my father viewed the dandelion as an enemy. He had tools and chemicals and spent countless hours all to defeat the dreaded dandelion threatening to destroy the suburban lawn. When I was in seminary, I was in a musical, a play called Quilters. It was a collection of stories, little vignettes from pioneer women and their struggles in pioneer days, and it was all set to the backdrop of quilt squares. But one of the stories was about a devastating wildfire that burned all the crops. The field was destroyed. There was nothing left but ashes. No food, no income, and seemingly no future. How could anything grow in the aftermath of such destruction? But one morning, they woke up, and the field was covered in dandelions. Where there once were ashes, there was now growth. Instead of an enemy, dandelions, in that instance, became hope for a future. Now, some weeds are actually beautiful. I mean, I like the yellow dandelions. But when I was a little girl, I wanted my wedding bouquet to be made of Queen Anne's lace. Now, some weeds are not only beautiful, but they also have medicinal properties. And some weeds are good to eat. So weeds aren't always bad. Obviously, I have trouble identifying weeds, but that doesn't seem to be the problem in this parable. When the plants came up, the slaves recognized right away that something was wrong. Look how similar the tare and the wheat look. It would be difficult to pull out only the weeds, but it's not only because of how similar they look. The real difficult part is that the roots become intertwined. The weeds wrap themselves around the wheat, so that if you pull up one, you damage the other. So the owner of the field says, wait. Leave it until the harvest, and then it will be separated. Burn the weeds and harvest the wheat. Simple, easy. But then the Gospel of Matthew turns ominous. We hear the allegorical interpretation from Jesus about the wheat being good people and the weeds being bad people and the weeds being burned and the evildoers being thrown into the furnace of fire where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Whew. Okay, followers of Christ, what do we do with this? Now, I have heard some traditional interpretations of this text. I mean, we shouldn't judge other people. God will judge who's evil and who is good. It's not our job to pull out the weeds in life. The older I get, I realize that everyone is capable of both good and evil. No one is perfect. I mean, some days I feel like a weed. I know I've done some weedy things in my life. There's some things that I need to ask forgiveness for, things that I regret. Sometimes I look around at the world and all I see are weeds. And our headlines are full of violence, brutality, and suspicion. Even in the halls of justice, I see weeds. We're supposed to trust our leaders, the police, the government. They're supposed to be the good guys. And yet, the Supreme Court seems to ignore the Constitution and the rights of citizens. The police have harmed the people they are charged with protecting. And Congress seems to govern for the sake of power and self-interest over the common good. Wait, so which are the weeds and which ones are the wheat? It's not always easy to identify the weeds from the wheat. I saw a beautiful quote from historian and novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He said, "If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were only necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the lines dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of their own heart?" The roots of the weeds get intertwined in the wheat. Good and evil, wheat and weeds, it's not clear cut, and it's not easy. I want it to be. I want the good guys to win and the bad guys to be punished. But life isn't like that. And maybe that's what this parable is trying to tell us. There is injustice in the world. And as followers of Christ, we try to stand up for justice and righteousness, but that doesn't mean judging and condemning others. One of my commentaries reminded me that God sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. If God shows such generosity of spirit, shouldn't we? I confess that sometimes when I look around at what's going on in the country, I see so many weeds, and I do want to chop them down. When I see bullies, I want to see weeping and gnashing of teeth. But that is not our call as followers of Christ. Even though we follow a protester who was killed by agents of the state, we are not called to pull up the weeds. Barbara Brown Taylor says that this parable teaches us to mind our own business, our business being reconciliation of the world through the practice of unshielded love. Unshielded love. Not shielded love, or conditional love, contractual love, or beneficial love. No. Unshielded love. Unconditional, extravagant love. May extravagant love, may unshielded love grow like a weed all over the world, and may we be the fertilizer. Amen.